Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
I now welcome our next panel to testify on amendments. Ms. Lee of California, Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas, Mr. Comer of Kentucky, Mr. Johnson of Georgia, Ms. Plaskett of the U.S. Virgin Islands, Mr. Sherman of California, Ms. Cammack of Florida. And we will now yield to Ms. Lee for her testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member, and all of our committee members for permitting me to testify in support of the amendment led by myself, Representative Pocan, and Ocasio-Cortez. The amendment cuts from this year's defense authorization bill egregious Pentagon budget increases that were added during the committee markup, which the chairman just mentioned. Our amendment will cut no less than $25.5 billion from the bill, trimming back the total level of the fiscal 22 NDAA to no more than the amount requested by President Biden. And today I'm reminded, and I just want to thank the chairman and ranking member of the Armed Services Committee of my former late boss, Ron Dellums, who chaired the Armed Services Committee. And the respect that he had from both sides of the aisle is truly still manifested, I think, with the chair and ranking member. So I just wanted to say that today because I'm thinking of Ron, who taught me so much about the Pentagon budget. The president's fiscal 2020 request, it's the largest in American history. For years now, the United States has been peerless in its military spending, exceeding the total spending of the next 11 countries combined. And yet Congress insists on piling more money into the Pentagon than our military leaders really asked for, despite DOD routinely returning unspent balances to the Treasury. Enough is enough. Americans are demanding that Congress rebalance our priorities and invest in the biggest challenges America faces. We face imminent threats from the COVID pandemic, climate change, growing economic inequality, and systemic racial and ethnic inequities. Also, domestic terrorism. It is time to shift our spending priorities to meet these priorities. I personally support much larger cuts to the Pentagon budget. Representative Pocan and I are also working on an amendment to cut the budget by 10%, and I hope that this amendment is also made in order. But we need to draw the line somewhere. Now, we know that there are billions in waste, fraud, and abuse as it relates to specifically the most current situation as it relates to Afghanistan. We know that trillions, mind you, trillions of taxpayer dollars were literally stolen. Yet we keep putting more taxpayer dollars into defense spending. So this amendment really is a good place to start, to send the message that Congress won't endorse constant inflation of the Pentagon budget. I urge you to allow this amendment to a vote in the full House as we consider the fiscal 2020 NDAA on the floor. It has broad-based support. I would also like to mention another amendment that I have submitted for your consideration to insist that the Pentagon and all of its subordinate departments and agencies pass a clean audit. It's really shameful that the Pentagon has not been able to do that. This is an issue, and we still keep funding it to the levels that are unacceptable. This is an issue that I've led on for many years together with my friend, Dr. Burgess. We find it outrageous that the Pentagon stands alone as the only federal cabinet department that has never passed a clean audit, despite a statutory requirement that all federal agencies do so. Thanks to our efforts and with the support of Chairman Smith, the law now requires the Pentagon to pass an audit. However, the law still lacks an effective mechanism for enforcement. So my audit amendment would impose escalating budgetary penalties on the Pentagon if it fails to pass a clean audit. We owe it to the taxpayer to ensure that the Pentagon balances its books. So thank you again for your time and for your consideration.
Thank you very much. Ms. Jackson Lee.
You hear me?
Yes.
Oh?
Yes.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you so very much. Mr. Chairman and the ranking member, thank you for your courtesies. First of all, let me support and associate myself with the Lee Amendment dealing with the Biden number for the NDAA. Thank the chairman and ranking member of the NDAA Armed Services Committee, and particularly the elements of this particular legislation that improves the quality of life for our military personnel and their families. Ask the questions about Afghanistan and the departure, and as well strengthens the response to sexual assault issues in the military. As it relates to my amendments, I would ask consideration of amendments 456, 59, and 463, which I think are self-explanatory but very important to the health and safety of our military personnel. Triple-negative breast cancer impacts Hispanic and African-American women. In particular, that would mean our soldiers, and has not had a high level of research. This is a very important request of $10 million. PTSD that I've asked for increase over the years because of the numbers of those now continuing to suffer from PTSD, even seeming not only to magnify, but to continue in years after their service in Iraq and Afghanistan in particular, and ask the support of this committee. 463 is one that I've lived through of a young cadet denied a command, even though they know that he had a stuttering problem, asking for our cadets to be screened and for them to be determined, cadets and midshipmen and others, to be determined what their plan will be at the end based upon their challenge, their physical challenge, or that they have been admitted with. This individual, or these individuals are admitted because they are competent in many other ways and would fit into any other command. But this would ask that the candidates granted admission to attend a military academy undergo screening for speech disorders and be provided the results of the screening and a list of warfare unrestricted officer positions and occupations, specialties that require successful performance on the speech test. I really ask my colleague, Rules Committee, to make that in order. Other amendments are self-explanatory. The assessment of the threat to national security of the Proud Boys and Boogaloo Boys, as we have seen in the January 6th insurrection. Then we are now facing the crisis in COVID surge, and what has not been occurring is the testing alongside of the vaccination. I ask that our National Guard and others still continue to be able to be utilized, particularly in states like Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, where these cases are still surging. The other amendments that follow that deal with reports of maternal mortality rates, also dealing with space debris, and the issue of avoiding the recruiting of our students to be trained to recognize, resist, and report against recruitment efforts by agents of foreign governments, which has been documented occurs when our students and others are studying abroad. My following amendment deals with the utilization of the pros of the armed forces who happen to be African American to ensure that their names be considered for conventions for military installations, infrastructure, vessels, and weapons systems, to increase the numbers of individuals who are of African American heritage to be named on different installations going forward. The last two amendments, I believe, in this climate are extremely important. Amendment 850, in the midst of the crisis of the Texas abortion law. And of course, I do support the previous legislation that was before the Rules Committee, with HR 3755. But I've asked my amendment, which provides that no state law that limits access to reproductive health care shall apply with respect to the provision or receipt of reproductive health care services at a military medical treatment facility located in the state. We have extensive facilities in Texas, and I would want to make sure this amendment would leave no doubt that there would be no stalking, no bounty, or anything on our service members and their family members who could receive services through the federal government by way of the state law. And I appreciate serious consideration of that amendment. And then finally, I would appreciate, with the recognition that Black men and women have played an integral role in the defense of and bravery of this nation since Crispus Attucks, an escaped slave during the Boston Massacre, to put themselves forward to serve as pilots, nurses, Marines, and West Point graduates, even under George Washington in the harsh winter of 1778. The Rhode Island Assembly passed a law allowing every able-bodied Negro, mulatto, or Indian man slave to serve. I think it is important, having not only received the integrated military in the last century, in the late half of the last century, that there be a task force to determine the impact of discrimination in the United States military, starting from the Revolutionary War. That is amendment number 471. I ask my colleagues to support these amendments and their inclusion, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Mr. Comer, you can testify.
No, I'm good. So I can go ahead and present my amendment. I like how quick and efficient you are here. Hopefully we'll have a good outcome to this, you know.
We're trying to be more user-friendly.
Well, thank you, Chairman McGovern. The Office of the Special Inspector General on Afghanistan Reconstruction has been one of the few candid voices on Afghanistan post 9/11. Known as SIGAR, that office has provided independent and objective oversight of the $145 billion provided by U.S. taxpayers to Afghanistan reconstruction for over a decade. The Special Inspector General has been particularly effective on my committee's fundamental concern how U.S. taxpayer dollars are spent and resources used. Unfortunately, SIGAR consistently found rampant corruption, waste, and fraud. In the unclassified version of its last quarterly report to Congress issued on July 30th, 2021, SIGAR provided a bleak and honest assessment, warning the Afghan government was facing an existential crisis in the wake of imminent U.S. withdrawal. Unfortunately, this warning came to fruition after the Biden administration's disastrous withdrawal and the Taliban's violent takeover. And while I supported a withdrawal, I certainly never dreamed the Biden administration would get it so wrong, stranding citizens and those with valid claims to come to America. The American people spent over $145 billion on Afghanistan reconstruction efforts, in addition to $837 billion directly on warfighting. Those monetary amounts pale in comparison to the almost 2,500 American service members who lost their lives in Afghanistan and over 20,000 military personnel who were wounded in action, not to mention approximately 66,000 Afghan national military and police officers who lost their lives as well. It's imperative that we understand the disposition of U.S. taxpayer funds and military equipment in Afghanistan. The Biden administration has no clue and worse, appears not to care. In the wake of the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, the administration has been unable to account for the whereabouts of equipment, funds, and even more troublesome, stranded American citizens and green card holders. Even without knowing the full extent to which military equipment fell into the hands of Taliban, we do know they now control M4 and M16 rifles and other advanced U.S. firearms, thousands of armored vehicles, communication equipment, night vision goggles, and even U.S. military aircraft and drones. It's also been reported that Afghan government officials looted U.S. taxpayer funds from the country when they fled. Even President Ghani has been implicated in spiriting millions of dollars in cash out of the country. He denies those reports and invites an investigation. Well, my amendment would give him one. The American people deserve an accurate assessment of the disposition of U.S. funds and property left in Afghanistan. And SIGAR is the entity within the federal government best suited for the job. My amendment would direct SIGAR to investigate the withdrawal of U.S. and allied forces from Afghanistan with an emphasis on understanding what military equipment was left behind in Afghanistan, whether the Taliban have control of that equipment, and whether it's being moved or sold to third parties. SIGAR would also be directed to investigate the disposition of U.S. taxpayer funds provided to Afghanistan and whether any Afghan government officials looted those funds or other U.S. provided property when they fled the country. The amendment directs SIGAR to submit progress reports on this withdrawal investigation to appropriate congressional committees, specifically the Committees on Appropriations, Armed Services, and Foreign Affairs, through its regular quarterly reports already required by law, and also to issue a final report at the conclusion of its investigation. This amendment should have garnered widespread bipartisan support. It's simple, straightforward, and necessary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for allowing me to testify in front of your committee today. I want to thank all of the committee members for their hard work. These days, there is not much that Democrats and Republicans see eye to eye on, but there is one thing upon which I think we can all agree, and that is that community confidence in law enforcement is probably at an all-time low right now. A huge factor in the loss of confidence in law enforcement has been the militarization of police departments across the land. The creeping militarization of police departments has been exacerbated by the 1033 program that sets up a pipeline to transfer surplus military equipment from war zones to domestic law enforcement agencies. Law enforcement agencies, without consent of the civilian authorities, have been able to obtain surplus military-grade weaponry directly from the Department of Defense under the 1033 program. It is civilian authorities who should decide whether such equipment is needed, not the law enforcement agencies themselves. The approval of city councils, county commissions, and other civilian authorities is bypassed under the 1033 program. Police agencies have often acquired this military-grade weaponry when they have not needed it, nor have they been trained as to how and when to use the equipment. But a requirement under the 1033 program that any acquired equipment be placed into use within 12 months of acquisition has resulted in the misuse of the equipment and the abuse of the civilian population against whom it has been used. The result has been communities alienated and a loss of confidence in law enforcement. For years, momentum has been building towards reform of the 1033 program. Over the last several decades, the 1033 program has transferred more than $7.4 billion in surplus military equipment to over 8,000 federal, tribal, state, and local law enforcement agencies across the nation. In 2014, when I first introduced the Stop Militarizing Law Enforcement Act, bipartisan legislation to reform the 1033 program, it was characterized as, quote, too progressive or too liberal. But I pressed forward. In fact, I've continued to offer this language each and every Congress because reform of the 1033 program is vital. I especially want to thank my colleague from California, Mr. McClintock, for co-sponsoring this amendment and joining me in this bipartisan effort. Representative McClintock recognizes the danger of law enforcement agencies avoiding civilian oversight and acquiring military-grade weaponry without support of the citizenry. We must seize this opportunity to enact much-needed reform. My bipartisan amendment is the kind of change our country needs and supports. Public polling indicates that a majority of Americans favor reform, and over 90 non-governmental organizations across the political spectrum supported this amendment when it was offered in the House Armed Services Committee earlier this month. This text has passed the House twice in the last year alone, and this common sense amendment goes only after items that endanger and divide communities while allowing the transfer of non-lethal supplies and equipment, such as tents, computers, and desks, to continue. American communities are not and should not be turned into battlefields, and people in our communities should not be looked at as enemy combatants. And yet, decades of militarization of our nation's law enforcement have transformed many police departments from a community-based regulatory arm to an occupying army that undermines the nature and character of our state and local governments. The lines between the law enforcement ethos, which is to protect and serve, and the military mindset of kill, destroy, and occupy has been blurred. Last year, we witnessed a response by law enforcement to civil rights demonstrations. We saw images of local police and military vehicles with military-grade weaponry trained on our citizens who were simply exercising their constitutional right to peacefully protest. Time and time again, we've seen irrefutable proof that this program must be reformed. Our current system goes against everything we stand for as Americans, and the time for reform is now. It's time to heal our communities and restore trust and confidence in law enforcement. The ending of the war in Afghanistan makes it even more important than ever that we close down this pipeline of military-grade weapons from foreign war zones to the streets of our nation. Over 17,000 pieces of military equipment have been declared excess or surplus and sent to the Defense Logistics Agency for distribution onto our streets. The time to act is now. I was disappointed when my 1033 amendment was not made in order last year, but enough is enough. This should not be a difficult vote. With American lives at stake, we must not delay. Mr. Chair, this is a bipartisan amendment that should be made in order, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I need to leave for another appointment, so
Does
I want to
anyone
thank the members.
object if Ms. Lee leaves? No, you may
Okay,
leave.
Thank you very much. Thank you, members.
All right, thank you. Ms. Plaskett.
Mr. Chairman, this is Sheila Jackson Lee.
Sheila, Ms. Jackson-Lee?
Yes, I'm in the same
Okay.
predicament, Mr. Chairman.
Anybody object if Ms. Jackson-Lee leaves? No, you can go.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman
Thank
and
you very
Ranking
much.
Member. Just as a point of personal privilege, it's really good to see Mr. Desaulnier here, my classmate on the Rules Committee, and just, you look fantastic, and just want to let you know that I'm really excited and grateful that you have. Perlmutter, don't hate, don't hate, don't hate. There's love for you as well, okay? Okay? I wanted to present my views to you on an amendment that I have to the National Defense Authorization Bill. Before going into this, I just want to explain that many of the territories, Guam, Northern Marianas, and the U.S. Virgin Islands sit outside of the customs zone. So if you were to visit the U.S. Virgin Islands or Guam or Northern Marianas, when you are leaving the islands, as some of you may have visited, you must go through customs. You cannot just get on a plane as you do in other places in the United States, but you have to go through a customs officer. With that, I am asking for an expedited visa program in the U.S. Virgin Islands, the same that is currently available in those other territories outside of the U.S. customs zone. This would assist the Virgin Islands in allowing visitors. Specifically, the Virgin Islands is seeking authority to expend a special non-immigrant visitor visa waiver program that is available to Guam and Northern Mariana Islands in the Pacific to our neighbors within the Caribbean. Adding the Virgin Islands to this already existing non-immigrant visitor visa waiver program would allow the Department of Homeland Security to consider approving visa-less entry solely into the Virgin Islands for up to 45 days, primarily for residents in neighboring Caribbean countries. This waiver would better enable the Virgin Islands to compete economically as well as socially with other islands and nations in the Caribbean community. Now, in 2012, by executive order, President Obama issued the executive order entitled Establishing Visa and Foreign Visitor Processing Goals and Task Force on Travel and Competitiveness, which directed the Secretaries of Commerce and the Interior to co-lead an interagency task force to increase efforts to expand the National Visa Waiver Program. Pursuant to this provision, the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security have promulgated regulations establishing a nationwide visa waiver program allowing nationals of certain countries to travel to the United States for stays up to 90 days. Now, what we are requesting in our amendment would apply solely to the Virgin Islands because we are outside of the customs zone, like other current territories in the Pacific, which currently allow a 45-day non-immigrant visa waiver program. Allowing individuals from other Caribbean islands to come into the Virgin Islands under an expedited visa process would really increase our tourism, as well as greater opportunities to host international events and support for our small businesses and medical facility. For example, our young people cannot invite other sports teams to come to the Virgin Islands from closer neighboring. It's easier for and not as far for an individual to come from a neighboring island, such as the British Virgin Islands, Antigua, some of the others, which are relatively closer to us than, say, a Miami or a Florida or some other countries, some other states that are even in the South. This would allow our young people to have other islands compete with us on a regular basis. Additionally, when we host our numerous yacht shows, regattas, we're unable to recoup the same amount of funds that a British Virgin Islands does because we do not have an expedited visa process. Even more so with our medical facilities. This program would enable treatment at our cancer center as well as our cardiac center and easier access to our 2 acute care hospitals in the Virgin Islands for people from the Eastern Caribbean residents who more often than not have family that live in our islands and would much rather be on a Caribbean island that is closer to them than going to London or Canada, other places where they have to go. These are full pay individuals who would also support the revenue basis at our hospitals in the Virgin Islands because of the facilities that we have there. Presently, because of the longer process, it's more difficult for them to come. My office has been working with the Judiciary Committee, as well as the Committee on Homeland Security, the Department of Homeland Security's General Counsel Office on the provisions of this bill, this amendment, and we ask that you approve the amendment 760, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman? Going once, going twice. Okay, we're going to go to Ms. Cammack.
Hello, can y'all hear me and see me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you all today. I'm speaking with you regarding my amendment number 460 to HR 4350 that would allow the Department of Veterans Affairs to utilize digitized versions of files, records, reports, and other papers or documents to be treated the same as originals. My amendment would require the VA to finally close the gap on any outstanding records that remain undigitized. Veterans have made enormous sacrifices for our country and deserve timely, effective access to care without lengthy adjudication of claims or benefits. Since the establishment of the Veterans Benefit Management System, the Veterans Benefits Administration has moved the process over 99% of compensation claims electronically. Yet, despite the encouraging progress, veterans still struggle with timely access to their medical records and approval of claims. So many of us, in fact, all of us here in Congress, work veterans' claims and cases, so this would benefit all of our veterans equally. Too many records still have not been digitized, and the delays caused by the pandemic are only worsened by this technology gap. In my own district, my office has worked to recover physical records on behalf of so many veterans. We have been told that half of a million veterans' records have been trapped in a backlog due to COVID-19 related staffing shortages. Without a workable solution to deliver effective records collection during the pandemic, the VA and the National Personnel Records Center held up critical care for those who have given so much. And I know so many of us here, Republicans and Democrats, we have all sent letters and worked to try to reduce this backlog. So my amendment here today continues the bipartisan work on modernizing the VA and fixing these delays once and for all. Mr. Chairman, I urge you to allow debate on amendment. I would also like to speak to you today on my amendment number 795 to HR 4350 to require a report on the feasibility of establishing a Customs and Border Protection pre-clearance facility in Taiwan. Last year, the Taipei International Airport applied to offer customs pre-clearance with strong support for approval of their applications on both sides of the Pacific. Taipei already hosts dozens of flights a week to and from the United States, and the number of visitors from Taiwan to the U.S. has increased by almost 30% since 2012. Taiwan already participates in both the U.S. Visa Waiver Program and the U.S. Global Entry Program, and would be the first country in the Asia Pacific to offer pre-clearance, an excellent choice given our close economic ties with the island, our shared values, and our ever more critical security partnership. Mr. Chairman, I urge you to allow debate on this amendment so that one day soon, the Taipei International Airport will soon have the first CBP pre-clearance facility in the Asia Pacific region. And finally, I would like to speak on my amendment number 847, HR 4350, to require the Secretary to conduct an anonymous survey, emphasize that, to determine the effects of the COVID-19 vaccine mandate on military service members. I am not anti-vaccine, but I am 100% anti-mandate. Individuals should be able to choose what is best for them and their families in consultation with their doctor. This should not be forced by a government at any level. Now, I believe even my colleagues who are pro-vaccine mandates would support this amendment to determine what effects the mandate at the DoD will have on reenlistment, recruitment, and readiness. Our troops represent the greatest fighting force this world has ever seen, and we deserve to fully understand whether a mandate, regardless of personal choice, will have an impact on the long-term effectiveness of this fighting force. We need to know what, if any, effect this policy will have on our national security. As such, I hope this committee will make the amendment in order. And as a personal point of privilege, I did want to weigh in very quickly and briefly on my colleague and friend from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, and his amendment number 534 with regard to the 1033 program. Just speaking right off the cuff, I understand many of the concerns that so many of my colleagues have regarding the militarization of police forces in our communities. As the wife of a first responder, my husband is a firefighter and a SWAT medic. In fact, the very vest, the ballistic vest that he wears on very dangerous callouts is a 1033 vest. This amendment is particularly concerning to me as a wife of a first responder, someone who utilizes a piece of 1033 equipment on a daily basis, because this amendment would take that away. I understand that they are looking for reforms, and I would welcome the opportunity to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to address these concerns and really move forward with these reforms. However, I think this is a step in the wrong direction. I come from a state that has over 60 inches of rain annually in a non-hurricane year. When we have had massive storms in the state of Florida, the MRAPs, they have become the high water rescue vehicles that have saved so many people. In fact, just this year, in my own neighborhood, on my street, we had, in the course of 5 hours, 4.5 feet of water collect, which then ended up in a water rescue of my neighbors across the street. The MRAP is what got them out and to safety. So I think there is definitely room for a conversation, but I would urge serious caution when moving forward on this, because so many small and mid-sized departments rely on this equipment, especially in the face of budget cuts and so many of the challenges that they're facing. There's a smart, deliberate way we can go about this without really gutting these departments that are already woefully under-resourced and understaffed. So I just want to thank the committee for their time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
We have Ms. Plaskett.
May I be excused? I have that
Anyone
same
have any
event.
objection if Ms. Plaskett leaves? You do?
We were excluded when the executive order was made for the Pacific Island territories, and so we're just asking to be included this time in the amendment.
You can go.
Thank you, sir.
All right, all right. And the final person on this panel is Mr. Davidson.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern. Thanks to the colleagues here on the Rules Committee. It is truly a thankless job, so let me be one of the people that says thank you for doing the work. I want to speak first on my amendment number 92. It would require the International Monetary Fund to oppose any increase in the weight of the Chinese RMB in the basket of currencies underpinning special drawing rights, unless our Treasury Secretary certifies that the RMB is actually freely transferable. As most people realize, when China joined the World Trade Organization, they promised to become a market economy. They are not a market economy, and they are increasingly a threat that should be addressed in the NDAA. And this bill would require, this amendment would require that the Treasury Secretary certify China is in compliance with all of its obligations under Article 7 of the Articles of Agreement, which in part state, no member shall, without the approval of the IMS, impose restrictions on the making of payments and transfers for current international transactions. Of course, China does this as part of their One Belt, One Road initiative to the people that they lend money to. In the preceding 12 months, there has not been a report submitted under Section 3005 of the Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act of 1988 or Section 701 of the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act of 2015, in which the People's Republic of China has been found to have manipulated its currency. China has instituted policies to ensure the RMB is freely usable, and then China adheres to the rules and principles of the Paris Club and the OECD arrangement on officially supported export credits. If the Treasury Secretary can certify these things, then by all means, then the IMF would be able to adjust as they have been doing. But in the absence of that certification, the U.S. would use its voting rights to oppose it.
Thank you.
I have a couple other amendments I'd like to speak about. One is my amendment 552. It's titled "Don't Draft Our Daughters." This amendment essentially, though worded differently because the text is different this year, passed in 2016 in a bipartisan way, though admittedly narrowly. There was a similar push in 2016 to require women to begin registering for the draft. And we felt that such an action should get a vote. And when there was a vote, recorded vote on the floor of the House, the people's representatives said, let's not do this. And this time, I think it's incredibly important that we also have a vote. Sentiments are different, and to be clear, I wish we didn't have a draft. I wish we would only institute a draft after Congress has constitutionally declared a war and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs comes back and says, we can't accomplish the mission you gave us without a draft. That's why we have a standing army, to buy time to raise that kind of a force and train them. But to make such a monumental shift and the requirement for women to register for the draft should truly be viewed as something that the people have had a voice in a recorded vote on the floor of the House. And again, it passed just in 2016. Next, my amendment 823 deals with President Biden's actions to remove all 18 presidentially appointed members of the Board of Visitors. This wasn't done in a targeted way to say, well, I have concerns about this member or that member. It was done simply because Donald Trump appointed them. And this is a clearly different tone than President Biden sounded on inauguration. And it is widely viewed as a way to politicize the military, not as a way to avoid politicizing the military. H.R. McMaster was just recognized as the distinguished graduate, the highest honor a graduate of the United States Military Academy can get, days after President Biden removed him from the Board of Visitors. Now, currently, we don't have a president so powerful he can remove the members of Congress who serve on that board. but the members of Congress who serve on that board are bipartisan, and the board should be bipartisan as well. They're appointed for a 3-year term. The board was established by this body, and simply in deference to the authority of Congress, we should say, you can't just remove them. We appointed them for a 3-year term for the same reason, that they would not be politicized. So if somebody should be removed for a cause, I think we all would say, sure, we have a reason to remove somebody, remove them. We might disagree about whether the cause is merited, but just to carte blanche politicize the board in that way is unprecedented and should be reversed. The other thing I would say is a sense of Congress that we think we established the term for a reason. We did it on purpose. We know that there's a turnover in the presidential administrations. Why wouldn't we support that term in the absence of removal for cause? Now, the last thing I'd like to do is speak to an amendment that my erstwhile colleague from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, has made to the NDAA. This is 599, the Safe Banking Act. Now, some people might say this may not be germane to the Defense Appropriations Act, but it is incredibly relevant to deal with cash in our economy. And the way that the cash ties to the black market in America is a national security issue. Border security is a national security issue, and the cartels are not just destroying day-to-day life for the people that many people in the room want to see helped, people that are really struggling. They're being exploited by these cartels. These people we saw over the weekend under the bridge, they're paying a toll if they make it into America to the cartels. They're in it for the money, and they're doing the same with the illicit finance in our drugs. There is truly a security tie for the Safe Banking Act. We need to get the cash out of the economy, fund legal activity, and this is what the Safe Banking does. I know there are people that have bigger, broader goals, and by all means pursue those and have a vote on those. We may disagree on some of those efforts, but I hope we can agree that we should pass the Safe Banking Act, even if it's part of the NDAA, and I appreciate Mr. Perlmutter's strong work on it. I yield.
Thank you. The gentleman yields.
Madam Chair, may I be excused?
Let me ask a final question of the members of the committee. Does anyone have a question for this panel?
I
Mr. Cole.
certainly have no objection to my friend leaving, but I just want to make a quick comment on Mr. Davidson.
Well, before I leave, I would like to respond.
Can you turn on your mic?
Before I leave, I would like to respond to Representative Cammack. The armored vest that her husband wears when he leaves home, that would not be covered under my amendment. That would be property that would be allowed to be distributed under the 1033 program. And with respect to the armored vehicles, that is the kind of equipment that the civilian authority needs to weigh in on before the law enforcement agency acquires it. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. You may be excused. Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I just wanted to associate myself with my friend's remarks. First of all, on Mr. Perlmutter's bills, well, I actually agree. This may not be the most elegant vehicle, but hey, because I do think there is a security issue here, and I think that's a very legitimate point my friend made. But I also wanted to associate myself with what he had to say about the appointments to the visitors, Board of Visitors with respect to the academies. Look, we can debate back and forth the merits of some of these individuals. I don't think you can debate General McMaster's or General Keane or people like that. And there's always a mix of political and military stuff. You really do need to have costs here. And I do think this is stretching executive prerogatives very far, and in a way that actually, whether you agree with the president's decisions or not, I think gets in the way of the institutional powers of our body, and also the rights of, there's always some holdover appointments. There ought to be a good reason. If this stands the way it is, then it's going to become the precedent, I'm afraid. And we'll just essentially clear them all out, other than the sitting members of Congress, anytime there's a change in the administration. So I think this was done again, I don't know the reasons why it was done, but I don't think it was well thought through. Again, if there had even been some give and take, then that might be at least more defensible than what we saw. So again, I think it's an unfortunate precedent. I really want to congratulate the gentleman for bringing this amendment. I think it's one we ought to look at institutionally as opposed to just narrowly partisan. I know it's meant that way, and I think on reflection, all of us, I would hope the majority of us at least would recognize this is an unfortunate precedent. So I hope my friend's amendment's made in order. Thank you very much. Yield back, Madam Chair. Well, my friend. Oh.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Perlmutter.
Yeah, and I wanted to thank my friend, Mr. Davidson, and he may recall there's a section in the Safe Banking Act that Mr. Tipton added concerning cartels and national security pieces of this thing. So Mr. Davidson helped kind of build that bill, and I appreciate your comments. I did have a question for you, sir. With respect to a couple of your amendments, did you offer these in Armed Services?
Well, I would love to, however, I'm not on the House Armed Services
Oh, I
Committee.
thought you were on Armed Services.
No, but if you want to put in a word for me.
I will. You belong on Armed Services. You should be on Armed Services. I yield back.
Okay, the gentleman yields. Seeing that there are no other questions for this panel, I will excuse this panel and want to welcome our next panel to testify on amendments.